The signal came through at 0347 hours, cutting through the silence of deep space like a knife. Captain Jake Morrison had been reviewing supply manifests in his quarters aboard the Horizon's Edge when the alarm began to wail. He was on the bridge in less than 30 seconds, still pulling on his jacket as he moved through the narrow corridors of his merchant vessel. Lieutenant Amy Brooks was already at her station, her fingers flying over the controls as she tried to clean up the incoming transmission. The static was terrible, breaking up every few seconds, but the frequency was unmistakable. It was the universal distress channel, the one that every ship in known space monitored at all times. Jake leaned over her shoulder, listening to the broken message that filtered through the speakers. A woman's voice, tight with fear and exhaustion, spoke in fragments between bursts of interference. She identified herself as Communications Officer Linda Martin of the passenger liner Celestial Dawn. Her ship had been attacked. The crew was dead or dying. Raiders had boarded them. They needed help. Please, anyone who could hear them, they needed help now. The message repeated 3 times before cutting off entirely. Amy ran the trace, her face growing pale as the results appeared on her screen. The Celestial Dawn was a colony transport, one of the big ones that carried families to the outer settlements. According to the registry, there were 1,500 souls aboard. Men, women, and children heading to new homes in the frontier systems. Jake felt his stomach clench. The coordinates put the Celestial Dawn deep in the Theta sector, which was Valdran space. The Valdran were supposed to patrol that route under the treaty agreements. Civilian ships paid good money for safe passage through their territory, but apparently something had gone very wrong. Amy looked up at him, waiting for orders. Jake knew what she was thinking because he was thinking the same thing. The Horizon's Edge was a small merchant vessel with a crew of 18. They had basic defensive weapons, nothing more. They were 3 days away from the distress signal at maximum burn. Whatever was happening to the Celestial Dawn would be long over by the time they arrived. But Jake also knew something else. He knew that when a human ship sent out a distress call, other humans answered. It was not a law or a regulation. It was something deeper than that. Something that lived in the bones of everyone who left Earth to make their way among the stars. You did not leave your people to die alone in the darkness. Jake made his decision. He told Amy to plot a course for the Celestial Dawn's last known position. Maximum speed, emergency burn if necessary. Then he told her to broadcast the distress signal on the human emergency network, the encrypted channel that connected every human ship in this sector of space. He wanted every human captain within range to know that their people were in trouble. The response came faster than Jake had expected. Within 10 minutes, acknowledgments began flooding in from across the sector. The cargo hauler Iron Mountain confirmed they were changing course. The transport ship New Horizon was already burning toward the coordinates. The exploration vessel Wanderer had dropped everything and was coming at full speed. More ships checked in as the minutes passed. Freighters and mining vessels, colony transports and survey ships, even a few private yachts owned by wealthy explorers. None of them were military. None of them were equipped for combat. But all of them were coming anyway. Jake stood on the bridge of his small ship and felt something stirring in his chest. Pride, maybe, or fear, perhaps both. He opened a channel to his crew and explained the situation. They had a choice, he said. They could continue on their planned route to the Proxima colonies, deliver their cargo and collect their pay. Or they could answer the distress call and risk everything for people they had never met. The vote was unanimous. Every member of his crew chose to go. As the Horizon's Edge accelerated toward the Theta sector, Jake began coordinating with the other responding ships. Captain Ben Torres of the Iron Mountain was a former engineer who had spent 20 years moving asteroids in the belt colonies. His mining hauler was massive and tough, built to survive impacts from space debris. He had some mining lasers that could be used as weapons, but he had never fired them at another ship. Captain Claire Martinez commanded the New Horizon, a transport vessel that usually carried supplies to remote stations. She had served in the colonial militia during the border skirmishes 15 years ago. She knew how to fight, but her ship was designed for cargo, not combat. Still, she was coming. She would find a way to help. Captain Kyle Harrison of the Wanderer was older than the rest of them, a grizzled explorer who had spent decades mapping uncharted systems. He had seen things go wrong on first contact missions, had fought his way out of bad situations more than once. His ship was small and fast, equipped with survey drones that he thought might be useful somehow. They compared notes over the communication channels, sharing what little combat experience existed between them. It was not much. They were civilians, merchants and workers and dreamers who had come to space for opportunity and adventure. But they were also human, and that meant something in the cold mathematics of the galaxy. The Valdren had learned to avoid direct conflict with humans, not because humanity had a powerful military, though they did, not because humans were technologically superior, because they were not. The Valdren avoided conflict with humans because humans were crazy. They came from a death world, a planet so hostile that simply surviving childhood there made you tougher than most species could imagine. Earth had gravity that would crush a Valdren, diseases that would kill them in hours, weather patterns that could flatten cities, and predators that hunted in packs. Humans had evolved in hell, and it showed in everything they did. Jake knew the Valdren looked down on his people. They thought humans were primitive, barbaric, too emotional and too willing to take risks. But right now, Jake did not care what the Valdren thought. Right now, there were 1,500 humans dying in the darkness, and he was going to do something about it. The horizon's edge pushed through the void at maximum burn, her engines glowing white-hot as they devoured fuel. Around her, across hundreds of light-years of empty space, other human ships were doing the same. They were converging on the Theta sector like a swarm, drawn by a distress call that most of them had only heard secondhand. Jake stood on his bridge and watched the sensor displays. 43 ships now. 43 human vessels had dropped everything to answer the call. It was not enough. It might never be enough, but they were coming anyway because that was what humans did. In the darkness between stars, the Deathworlders were gathering. And somewhere ahead in the Theta sector, raiders who had thought themselves safe were about to learn a very hard lesson about what happened when you threatened human lives. Commander Vex studied the tactical display with growing unease. His crystalline form reflected the blue light of the screens as he processed the information flowing in from across the Theta sector. 43 human vessels had altered their courses in the past 6 hours. Now the number had climbed to 58. All of them were converging on a single point in Valdren space. The commander's aide, a younger officer named Kryn, stood nearby with visible confusion on his transparent features. He did not understand what was happening. Neither did Vex, if he was being honest with himself. The humans were risking everything to respond to a distress call from a ship they had probably never heard of before today. Vex pulled up the records on the Celestial Dawn. It was a civilian transport, registered out of the Mars colonies, carrying colonists to one of the outer settlements. The ship had purchased safe passage through Valdren space under the standard treaty agreements. It should have been protected by Valdren patrol vessels, but Vex knew the truth that the records did not show. The patrol captains in that sector had taken bribes from Krell raiders to look the other way. It was a common enough practice in the outer regions. The Valdren military was stretched thin, and the captains often supplemented their income through such arrangements. Usually the targets were non-aligned vessels, ships from minor species who had no one to complain to. But someone had made a mistake. They had let the Krell attack a human ship, and now the humans were coming. Vex opened a communication channel to the human embassy on the Valdren homeworld. Ambassador Lisa Grant appeared on his screen, her face tired but professional. She had held her position for 5 years, working to build trust between their species. It had been slow, difficult work. Vex wondered if all of that was about to collapse. The ambassador listened as Vex explained the situation. Human ships were massing in Valdren space without authorization. This was a violation of treaty protocols. The Valdren military needed to know what was happening and why. Lisa's response was calm but firm. A human ship was in distress. The humans were responding to help their people. Nothing was going to stop them. If the Valdren tried to interfere, there would be consequences. She did not elaborate on what those consequences might be, but something in her tone made Vex's crystalline structure feel cold. The commander closed the channel and returned his attention to the tactical display. More ships were arriving every hour. The humans were not organized. There was no central command, no military coordination that he could detect. They were simply showing up, one vessel at a time, all heading toward the same coordinates. It was chaos. It was inefficient. It was everything the Valdren military had been trained to avoid. And yet, watching it unfold, Vex felt something he rarely experienced: uncertainty. Aboard the Iron Mountain, Captain Ben Torres was conducting his own tactical assessment. His mining hauler was the largest ship in the growing human fleet, a massive vessel designed to process asteroids in deep space. It was not built for combat, but it was incredibly tough. The hull plating could withstand impacts from space debris traveling at orbital velocities. The mining lasers could cut through solid rock, and the cargo holds were filled with equipment that might prove useful in unexpected ways. Ben had spent the last 3 hours talking with the other captains, trying to organize some kind of plan. It was like herding cats. Everyone had ideas. No one wanted to wait. The miners wanted to charge in and start shooting. The transport captains wanted to establish a perimeter. The exploration crews wanted to scout ahead and gather intelligence. Finally, Jake Morrison from the Horizon's Edge had cut through the chatter with a simple question. What would hurt the raiders most? What would make them regret attacking a human ship? The answer, when it came, was unanimous. They needed to hit the raiders hard and fast with everything they had. No warnings, no negotiations, just overwhelming force delivered without mercy. The raiders had attacked civilians. They had killed human crew members. They had taken human families hostage. There would be no forgiveness for that. Ben felt his jaw tighten as he listened to the other captains agree. He was not a violent man by nature. He had spent his career moving rocks and processing ore, building the infrastructure that supported human colonies across the sector. But he was also human, and that meant certain things were not negotiable. You did not harm children, you did not take families as slaves, and you definitely did not expect to walk away from it. The human fleet continued to grow. The freighter Storm Chaser arrived, followed by the science vessel Explorer's Dream. A colony, transport called Mayflower's Hope, dropped out of hyperspace with a volunteer crew of former military personnel who had heard the call and commandeered the ship from its scheduled route. More vessels kept coming, each one adding to the strange, chaotic armada that was forming in the void. Captain Claire Martinez of the New Horizons spent her time reviewing what little combat training she remembered from the militia. It had been 15 years since the border skirmishes, 15 years since she had fired a weapon at another living being. She had hoped never to do it again. But life rarely cared about what you hoped for. Her ship carried supplies, mostly medical equipment and construction materials destined for a remote station. She had already started repurposing what she could. Medical lasers could be adjusted to higher power settings. Construction drones could be armed with improvised explosives. It was crude and desperate, but it might be enough. Claire thought about the people aboard the Celestial Dawn. 1,500 civilians, families, children, people who had left Earth or Mars or Luna to build new lives among the stars. They had trusted the treaties to keep them safe. They had believed that the galaxy operated by rules and agreements. Now they were learning the hard truth that many humans already knew. The galaxy did not care about you. If you wanted to survive out here, you had to be willing to fight for it. Captain Kyle Harrison of the Wanderer was the oldest of the responding captains. He had been exploring unknown systems since before most of them were born. He had seen beautiful things in the depths of space, wonders that took his breath away even after decades of travel. But he had also seen the darker side of the galaxy. He had met species who viewed other sentients as nothing more than resources to be exploited. He had barely survived encounters that should have killed him. Kyle checked his weapon systems one more time. The Wanderer was small and fast, designed for survey work rather than combat. But he had learned long ago that sometimes the best defense was not having any defense at all. His ship was equipped with dozens of survey drones, small automated craft that could scan planets and asteroids from a distance. He had spent the past few hours reprogramming them. Now they were guided missiles, each one carrying enough explosive power to cripple a small raider ship. The fleet reached the outer edge of the Theta sector, 26 hours after the initial distress call. The Celestial Dawn's emergency beacon had gone silent hours ago. That could mean many things, none of them good. The raiders might have destroyed it. They might have found it and disabled it, or the ship itself might have been destroyed. But the humans kept coming anyway. They did not turn back. They did not hesitate. They pushed forward into unknown danger, because somewhere ahead their people needed them. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Horizon's Edge and felt the weight of what they were about to do. 58 civilian ships were following a distress call into hostile territory. Most of them would probably die. The raiders would have superior weapons and better training. The odds were terrible, but Jake also knew something the raiders did not. Humans did not calculate odds the same way other species did. When you came from a world as hostile as Earth, when you had evolved to survive conditions that would kill most other sentients, you learned something important. You learned that sometimes survival was not about the odds. Sometimes it was about refusing to quit no matter what. The human fleet entered the Theta sector in a loose formation, each ship ready for whatever came next. In the darkness ahead, the celestial dawn waited, and aboard that ship, 1,500 humans held on to hope, not knowing that half the sector was coming to save them. The Krell raiding party thought they had won. Commander Skazex, his insectoid body clicking with satisfaction, watched his warriors herd the last of the human prisoners into the cargo holds of the Celestial Dawn. The ship's crew had fought harder than expected, but they were all dead now. The civilians had been easier to control once they understood the consequences of resistance. Skazex calculated the profits in his mind. 1,500 humans would fetch excellent prices in the slave markets. Humans were durable, capable of surviving in conditions that killed most species. They could work in toxic environments, endure high gravity, resist diseases that would devastate other laborers. The demand was always high. This single raid would make him wealthy beyond his dreams. The Krell had 6 ships in their raiding party. The Widow's Fang was attached to the Celestial Dawn like a parasite, its boarding tube still connected to the human vessel. The other 5 ships formed a loose perimeter around their prize, watching for Valdran patrols that would never come. Skazex had paid good money to ensure the patrol routes were empty today. Everything had gone according to plan. The humans had been surprised and overwhelmed. Their distress call had gone out, but help was days away at minimum. By the time anyone arrived, the Krell would be long gone with their cargo. It was simple, efficient, and profitable. Then the sensors began screaming. A massive vessel dropped out of hyperspace less than 50 kilometers away. The Iron Mountain appeared like a mountain of metal and purpose, its bulk dwarfing the largest Krell raider. Before Skazex could even process what he was seeing, the human mining hauler opened fire. The mining lasers were designed to carve apart asteroids. Against the Widow's Fang shields, they were devastating. The protective barriers flickered and died under the sustained assault. Skazex screamed orders to his crew, trying to detach from the Celestial Dawn and bring weapons to bear. But the humans were not done. 3 more vessels appeared from hyperspace in quick succession. The Horizon's Edge came in from above, its weapons targeting the Widow's Fang's engines. The New Horizon materialized between 2 of the patrolling Krell ships, using its massive bulk as a shield. The Wanderer dropped into normal space and immediately released a swarm of small objects that streaked toward the nearest raider. Skazex realized with growing horror that he had made a terrible mistake. These were not rescue ships. This was an attack fleet. The humans had come ready for war. The Krell commander ordered his ships to return fire. Plasma cannons lit up the darkness, sending superheated bolts toward the human vessels. The weapons were powerful enough to crack planetary shields. They should have torn through the human ships like paper, but the humans had not brought paper. They had brought ships built to survive the harsh realities of deep space work. The Iron Mountain's hull plating, designed to withstand asteroid impacts, barely registered the plasma fire. The transport ships absorbed hits that should have destroyed them and kept coming. One freighter took a direct strike to its port side that ripped open 3 decks to vacuum. The crew sealed the breaches and continued fighting from exposed corridors, their emergency suits protecting them from the void. Captain Ben Torres coordinated the Iron Mountain's attack with grim efficiency. His mining lasers methodically targeted the Widow's Fang's critical systems. Engines first, then weapons, then life support. He had spent 20 years cutting rock with precision. Now he applied that same precision to dismantling a raider ship. Jake Morrison brought the Horizon's Edge in close, risking his small vessel to cover the larger ships. His weapons were limited, but he used them well. Every shot counted. Every hit disrupted the Krell formation a little more. He could see other human ships arriving now, dropping out of hyperspace one after another. The ragtag fleet was becoming a swarm. Claire Martinez piloted the New Horizon with the skill of someone who had fought in real battles before. She positioned her transport between the Krell ships and the damaged Celestial Dawn, taking hits meant for the helpless colony vessel. Her makeshift weapons were crude, but they worked. Medical lasers set to maximum power burned through Krell armor. Construction drones carrying improvised explosives slammed into enemy shields. Kyle Harrison's survey drones proved devastatingly effective. The small automated craft were fast and maneuverable, difficult for the Krell weapons to track. Each one carried explosives designed for mining operations. When they impacted the raider ships, they blew holes through armor plating and disabled critical systems. One drone found its way into the engine exhaust of a Krell cruiser. The resulting explosion split the ship in half. Aboard the Celestial Dawn, the prisoners heard the sounds of battle and understood what was happening. Someone had come for them. Humans had answered their distress call and were fighting to save them. That knowledge spread through the cargo holds like electricity. A former Marine named Greg Sullivan had been traveling with his wife and 2 children when the raiders attacked. He had watched helplessly as the Krell warriors killed the crew and rounded up the passengers. But now, with the raiders distracted by the attack outside, he saw an opportunity. Greg began organizing the other prisoners. They had no weapons, but they had numbers and they had motivation. When the Krell guards left to reinforce the boarding parties, Greg led a rush on the remaining warriors. It was brutal and desperate. Humans died, but more Krell died. And slowly, section by section, the prisoners began retaking their ship. Outside, the battle intensified. More human vessels continued to arrive. The freighter Storm Chaser came in firing everything it had. The science vessel Explorer's Dream took catastrophic damage but kept fighting until its hull finally broke apart. The escape pods launched, but not before the ship's final weapons burst disabled a Krell destroyer. Skzex watched his raiding party being systematically destroyed by a force that should not exist. These were civilian vessels, merchants and miners. They had no business being this effective in combat. But they fought with a coordination that seemed impossible for ships with no central command. The truth was simpler than Skzex understood. The humans were coordinating, but not through traditional command structures. Every captain maintained constant communication with every other captain. They shared targeting data, warned each other of threats, covered each other's weaknesses. They rotated damaged ships to the rear while fresh vessels pushed forward. It was chaotic and improvised, but it worked because every captain understood the mission. Save the Celestial Dawn. Destroy anyone who threatened human lives. A Krell cruiser tried to target the New Horizons engines. 3 human ships immediately shifted position to block the shot. When another raider attempted to flee to hyperspace, 5 vessels pursued it together, their combined fire overwhelming its shields before it could escape. The humans fought like a pack of predators, coordinating instinctively without needing orders. The massive cargo hauler Titan's Pride arrived in the middle of the battle. Captain Rita Price brought her Leviathan of a ship directly through the Krell formation. Her cargo bay doors were open to vacuum, and as she passed between enemy vessels, dozens of mining drones launched from her hold. Each one had been reprogrammed as a kinetic kill vehicle. The drones scattered the Krell ships like insects, forcing them into defensive positions where other human vessels could target them more easily. Skzex made the call to retreat. His raiding party was being annihilated. 4 of his 6 ships were already destroyed or crippled beyond repair. The Widow's Fang was venting atmosphere and had lost all main power. His own ship was damaged and surrounded. If they stayed, they would all die. He ordered the surviving vessels to abandon the Celestial Dawn and jump to hyperspace. 2 ships managed to escape. The others were destroyed by human fire before their hyperspace engines could engage. The Widow's Fang, still attached to the colony vessel, was boarded by humans from the Iron Mountain. The Krell crew surrendered within minutes. When the shooting finally stopped, the space around the Celestial Dawn was filled with debris and broken ships. 7 human vessels had been destroyed completely. Another dozen were so badly damaged they would never fly again without extensive repairs. The casualties numbered in the hundreds, but the Celestial Dawn was safe. The 1,500 civilians aboard were alive, and every single Krell raider had been eliminated or driven away. Jake Morrison stood on his bridge and felt exhaustion wash over him. His ship had taken damage but had survived. Around him, the human fleet began the process of securing the area and checking for survivors. The rescue operation started immediately, with the same coordination that had characterized the battle. They had won. Against impossible odds, with civilian ships and improvised weapons, they had defeated a professional raiding party. But the cost had been terrible. So many dead, so many ships destroyed. Jake wondered if it had been worth it. Then he received a transmission from the Celestial Dawn. It was Greg Sullivan, the Marine who had led the prisoner uprising. His voice was hoarse but filled with emotion. He thanked Jake and every captain who had come. He said the people aboard his ship would never forget what had been done for them today. Jake realized then that it had been worth it. Every life lost, every ship destroyed, every risk taken. Because that was what humans did. They came for each other always. Commander Vex stood in the observation deck of the Valdrin command station and watched the aftermath unfold. The battle was over. The human fleet had won, though calling it a fleet seemed generous. It was more like a collection of civilian ships that had somehow coordinated themselves into an effective fighting force. The sensor logs told a story that Vex found difficult to process. The humans had lost 7 ships completely destroyed and another 12 crippled beyond immediate repair. The casualty count was approaching 300 dead with many more wounded. By any reasonable military assessment, those losses were catastrophic. A Valdrin commander who suffered such casualties would face a court-martial, but the humans were celebrating. Vex could hear it on the open communication channels. The human captains were congratulating each other, sharing stories of the battle, checking on wounded crew members. There was grief, certainly. The dead were being mourned. But underneath the sadness was something else. Pride, satisfaction. The unmistakable sense of a mission accomplished. They had saved their people. Nothing else mattered. Vex opened a communication channel to the human fleet. He needed to speak with whoever was in command. The response came from Captain Jake Morrison of the Horizon's Edge. The small merchant vessel had somehow survived the entire battle despite being one of the first to engage. The Valdrin commander tried to maintain his composure as he spoke. The humans had violated Valdrin space with an armed fleet. They had engaged in military action without authorization. They had destroyed ships and killed sentients within territory protected by Valdrin law. This was, by any definition, an act of war. Jake's response was cold enough to frost the communication equipment. He pointed out that the Celestial Dawn had been traveling under treaty protection. The Valdrin were supposed to patrol this sector. Where had those patrol ships been when the Krell attacked? Where were the vessels that should have kept human civilians safe? The silence that followed was damning. Vex knew the answer. The patrol captains had been bribed to look the other way. It was a common practice in the outer sectors, one that the High Command unofficially tolerated. The targets were usually minor species with no political power. No one was supposed to notice or care, but someone had made a mistake. They had let the Krell attack humans, and now everyone was going to notice. Jake continued speaking, his voice carrying a weight that made Vex's crystalline structure feel cold. The humans had come for their people. They would always come. Distance did not matter. Danger did not matter. Odds did not matter. When a human sent out a distress call, other humans answered. The Valdrin needed to remember that next time they thought about looking the other way. Vex closed the channel without responding. What could he say? The human was right. The Valdrin had failed in their treaty obligations. They had allowed civilians under their protection to be attacked. And now humans had died cleaning up a mess that should never have happened. The commander began composing his report to High Command. It would not be a pleasant document to write. The damaged human ships limped toward the nearest neutral station, a trading post called Haven's Gate. It was 3 days away at the speed the crippled vessels could manage. The journey was difficult. Ships that had taken damage during the battle began experiencing secondary failures. Hull breaches expanded. Life support systems failed. Medical supplies ran low. The human fleet worked together to keep everyone alive. Ships with functioning medical bays took on wounded from the damaged vessels. Engineers moved between ships using whatever materials they could find to jury-rig repairs. Crews shared food and water and oxygen. No one was left behind. No one was abandoned. Captain Ben Torres of the Iron Mountain coordinated much of the rescue effort. His massive mining hauler had survived the battle relatively intact, and his cargo holds were converted into temporary medical facilities. The injured were brought aboard in shuttle after shuttle. His crew, trained for mining operations, learned emergency medicine on the job. Dr. Peter Walsh had been traveling aboard one of the transport ships when the distress call went out. He was a civilian doctor, heading to a colony world to open a new practice. When the call came, he had insisted his ship answer. Now he moved through the makeshift hospital aboard the Iron Mountain, performing surgeries with whatever equipment was available. Peter had not slept in over 40 hours. He had operated on blast injuries, radiation burns, decompression trauma, and a dozen other conditions he had only read about in medical journals. His hands shook from exhaustion, but he kept working. People were dying. He could not stop. A nurse named Linda Crane helped organize the chaos. She had been a passenger on the Celestial Dawn, taken hostage by the Krell raiders. Now she was working alongside the rescuers, treating the wounded from the ships that had come to save her. She moved through the corridors with purpose, triaging patients and coordinating care. She had training from her work at a colony medical station, and she used every bit of it now. The most severe cases were kept alive through sheer determination and improvised solutions. Engineers fabricated medical equipment from spare parts. Mining scanners were reprogrammed as diagnostic tools. Environmental suits were sterilized and used as surgical isolation chambers. It was crude and desperate, but it kept people breathing. Haven's Gate appeared in the distance on the third day. The trading station was a neutral port, operated by a collective of minor species who made their living facilitating commerce between the major powers. It was not large, and it was definitely not equipped to handle a disaster on this scale. The station administrator, a being named Quellen from a species the humans called traders, received the incoming fleet with growing alarm. Dozens of damaged ships, hundreds of wounded, refugees from a destroyed vessel, all converging on his small station. His medical facilities could not handle this. His docking bays were not large enough. His supplies were inadequate. But the humans did not ask for permission. They simply arrived. The damaged ships docked wherever they could find space. The wounded were transferred to any available area. The station's medical staff was overwhelmed within hours. Human casualties filled the corridors, the cargo bays, every spare meter of available space. The station's doctors did what they could, but it was like trying to empty an ocean with a bucket. Then more ships began arriving. But these were not the battle-damaged vessels from the Theta sector. These were fresh human ships, responding to a new call that had gone out across the emergency network. Medical vessels, supply freighters, even military ships from the nearest human outpost. They came carrying doctors and nurses, medicine and equipment. Everything needed to treat the wounded. Dr. Peter Walsh found himself working alongside colleagues who had traveled days to reach Haven's Gate. They set up proper surgical facilities in cargo bays. They established triage systems in docking corridors. They brought order to the chaos through experience and determination. A surgeon named Dr. Kate Morrison arrived on a medical frigate from the Mars colonies. She had been in the middle of a lecture when the call came through. She had left immediately, commandeering the nearest available ship. Now she worked 72 hours straight, performing surgeries that saved lives. Linda Crane continued coordinating the medical response with a group of nurses who had come from across the sector. They organized medication distribution, monitored patient conditions, ensured that the most critical cases received care first. Many of them were volunteers who had abandoned their regular jobs to help strangers they would never meet again. Commander Vex received reports of the medical operation with a sense of disbelief. The humans had mobilized a civilian medical response that rivaled military disaster relief operations. Doctors and nurses were arriving from colonies dozens of light years away. Ships were donating supplies without asking for payment. The coordination was seamless, as if they had practiced this scenario 1,000 times, but they had not practiced. They were improvising, the same way they had improvised the battle fleet. They were simply doing what needed to be done because their people needed them. Quellen, the station administrator, watched the human medical operation with awe. His own species valued family bonds. They protected their hive mates and colony mates. But this was different. These humans were not related. Many had never met before. They came from different worlds, different cultures, different backgrounds. Yet they worked together as if they were a single organism with a single purpose. Save the wounded. Help the survivors. Leave no one behind. It was the most alien thing Quellen had ever witnessed, and it was beautiful in a way that made his breathing organs tighten with emotion. The casualties from the Theta sector incident would take weeks to fully recover. Some would never fully heal, but they were alive. They were safe. And they were surrounded by other humans who would do anything to help them. Word of what had happened spread across the galaxy faster than light-speed communication could carry it. The story was translated into 1,000 languages, analyzed by military strategists and xenopsychologists. The Deathworlders had mobilized civilian ships to fight a war. They had taken terrible casualties but had won anyway. And then they had mobilized again to save the wounded. The galaxy was beginning to understand something important about humanity. The Valdrin High Command convened in their crystalline chamber, a place where the most important decisions affecting their empire were made. The chamber was ancient, its walls carved from living crystal that resonated with the voices of those who spoke. Today, those voices carried tension and uncertainty. Commander Vex presented his report on the Theta Sector incident. He spoke clearly and without embellishment, laying out the facts as they had occurred. A human civilian vessel had been attacked by Krell raiders while under Valdrin protection. Valdrin patrol ships had been absent due to bribed commanders. A human civilian fleet had responded, destroying the raiders and saving their people. Human casualties had been severe. The political implications were worse. The council members listened in silence. When Vex finished, the chamber erupted in debate. Some argued that the humans had violated Valdrin sovereignty and must be punished. Others pointed out that the Valdrin had failed in their treaty obligations first. Still others worried about the military implications of what they had witnessed. The eldest council member, a being whose crystalline form had grown opaque with age, finally spoke. The question was not about sovereignty or treaties or military capability. The question was about what kind of species humanity truly was, and more importantly, what that meant for the galaxy. The Elder had studied human history. He had read about their wars, their conflicts, the terrible things they had done to each other over the millennia. But he had also read about their rescues, their aid missions, their seemingly irrational need to help strangers. The Theta Sector incident was not an anomaly. It was perfectly consistent with human behavior throughout their recorded history. Humans would sacrifice themselves for their own. They would do it without orders, without coordination, without even knowing the people they were saving. It was not logical. It was not efficient. But it was absolutely predictable. And that made humanity unlike any other species in the known galaxy. The Council voted on a course of action. The decision was unanimous. The Valdrin Empire would issue a formal apology to humanity. They would pay reparations to the families of those lost in the battle. The patrol captains who had accepted bribes would be court-martialed. The patrol routes would be reinforced with new ships and new commanders who understood the cost of failure. It was humiliating for the proud Valdrin, but it was necessary. They could not afford to have humanity as an enemy. Not because humans had superior military power, but because humans would come when called regardless of the cost. That made them unpredictable and dangerous in ways that conventional military strength could never match. Ambassador Lisa Grant received the Valdrin apology with professional grace. She had spent 5 years building diplomatic bridges between their species. She had weathered insults and setbacks and cultural misunderstandings, and now finally she felt like progress was being made. But Lisa also knew this was just the beginning. The Theta Sector incident had changed something fundamental in the galaxy's perception of humanity. Other species were watching. They were reassessing their relationships with Earth and its colonies. Some would become friendlier. Others would become more cautious. But none of them would forget what they had seen. Aboard Haven's Gate, the recovery continued. Dr. Peter Walsh finally allowed himself to sleep after 80 hours of continuous work. He collapsed in a borrowed bunk and dreamed of nothing. When he woke 12 hours later, he learned that all of his critical patients had survived. The relief made him cry. Linda Crane organized a memorial service for those who had died in the battle. It was held in the largest cargo bay on the station, the only space big enough to hold everyone who wanted to attend. Humans from dozens of ships gathered together. They shared stories of the fallen. They honored the sacrifice. They promised to remember. Captain Jake Morrison spoke at the memorial. He was not a politician or a philosopher. He was just a merchant captain who had answered a distress call. But his words carried weight with the assembled crowd. He spoke about courage and sacrifice. He talked about the ships that had come when called, knowing the odds were against them. He mentioned the crews who had fought with improvised weapons and desperate tactics. He honored the doctors and nurses who had worked themselves to exhaustion saving lives. And he reminded everyone that what they had done was not special. It was simply human. When humans heard the call, they came. That was the way it had always been. That was the way it would always be. From Earth's ancient history to the furthest colonies in deep space, humans protected their own. Distance did not matter. Danger did not matter. Cost did not matter. When the call went out, they answered. Jake finished his speech with a simple statement. They were far from home. They were scattered across a galaxy that did not always welcome them, but they were never alone. When the call went out, they would answer. Today, tomorrow, 100 years from now, they would always answer. The memorial ended with a moment of silence for the dead. Then the humans returned to their work. There were still wounded to treat, ships to repair, families to notify. Life continued as it always did. Captain Ben Torres spent his days coordinating repairs to the damaged vessels. The Iron Mountain had taken significant damage during the battle, but it was still spaceworthy. Other ships were not so fortunate. Some would need to be towed to proper shipyards. Some would be salvaged for parts. Some would never fly again, but Ben was not discouraged. Ships could be rebuilt. Equipment could be replaced. What mattered was that the people had survived. The Celestial Dawn's passengers were safe. The crews who had come to save them were recovering. And the galaxy had learned an important lesson about humanity. Captain Claire Martinez of the New Horizon received a commendation from the colonial government for her actions during the battle. She accepted it quietly, uncomfortable with the attention. She had only done what needed to be done. Any other captain would have done the same, but that was not true, and Claire knew it. Most species would not have risked everything for strangers. Most civilizations would have calculated the odds and stayed away. Humans were different. They came from a world so hostile that they had evolved to be stubborn survivors who refused to quit. And they had brought that stubbornness with them to the stars. Captain Kyle Harrison of the Wanderer began preparing for his next exploration mission. He had lost half his survey drones in the battle, but he could replace them. The important thing was that he had been there when it mattered. He had answered the call. He had done his part. Kyle thought about the young captains he had fought beside. Jake Morrison with his small merchant ship, Ben Torres with his mining hauler, Claire Martinez with her transport vessel. None of them had been warriors. None of them had wanted to fight, but they had fought anyway because their people needed them. That was humanity in a nutshell. Give them a reason to care and they would move mountains. Threaten their own, and they would move fleets. Commander Vex filed his final report on the Theta Sector incident. He included tactical analysis, casualty figures, and strategic recommendations, but he also included something unusual for a military report. He included a personal assessment. Vex wrote that humanity's greatest weapon was not their technology or their military strength. It was their refusal to abandon each other. Any species could be trained to fight, but you could not train someone to care deeply enough to risk everything for strangers. Either you felt it or you did not. And humans felt it in a way that made them dangerously unpredictable. The Valdrin military needed to understand this. When planning future interactions with humanity, they could not rely on conventional strategic calculations. Humans would do things that made no logical sense if their own were threatened. They would sacrifice ships and lives without hesitation. They would come from across the sector to answer a distress call. And they would win battles they had no business winning through sheer determination. The report was filed and distributed to every Valdrin military commander. It became required reading at the Command Academy. Future generations of Valdrin officers would study the Theta Sector incident as an example of human behavior under pressure. But the lesson spread beyond just the Valdrin. Other species received intelligence reports about what had happened. The story was analyzed and discussed in council chambers and military headquarters across the galaxy. Everyone wanted to understand what they had witnessed. The conclusion was always the same. Humanity was not like other species. They had evolved on a death world, and it showed in everything they did. They were tough, adaptable, and fiercely protective of their own. They would come when called, no matter the cost. And they would keep coming until their people were safe or they were all dead. The galaxy had seen military powers rise and fall. They had witnessed empires built on conquest and trade and diplomacy, but they had never seen anything quite like humanity. A species that would mobilize civilian ships to wage war. A species that would sacrifice hundreds to save thousands. A species that simply would not quit. The crimson warning on Earth's classification in the galactic databases was updated. It no longer simply listed Earth as an extreme hazard world. Now it included additional information that every species needed to know. The warning stated that humans responded to distress signals from their own with. 3 months after the Theta Sector incident, Captain Jake Morrison sat in a council chamber on Mars. He had been invited to speak before the Colonial Assembly, a gathering of representatives from human settlements across the sector. They wanted to hear his account of what had happened. They wanted to understand how a collection of civilian ships had defeated a professional raiding party. Jake felt uncomfortable in the formal setting. He was a merchant captain, not a politician, but he had been asked to come, and he had learned long ago that you answered when called. So he stood before the assembly and told his story. He spoke about the distress signal that had arrived in the middle of the night. He described the decision to answer, knowing the odds were terrible. He talked about the other captains who had changed course, abandoning their routes and their contracts to help strangers. He explained the chaotic battle, the improvised tactics, the terrible cost in lives and ships. When Jake finished speaking, the chamber was silent. Then the questions began. The representatives wanted to know about coordination, about command structure, about military doctrine. They seemed to think there had been some grand plan, some hidden organization that had made the response possible. Jake tried to explain that there had been no plan. There had only been the distress call and the decision to answer. Everything else had been improvised in the moment. The captains had worked together because that was what humans did. They had fought together because their people needed them. It was not complicated. It was just human nature. One representative, a woman named Michelle Stevens from the Europa colonies, asked the question that everyone was thinking. Would they do it again? If another distress call came through tomorrow, would the same captains risk their lives and ships to answer? Jake did not hesitate. Yes, they would do it again. They would do it 100 times, 1,000 times. As long as there were humans in danger, other humans would come to help. That was the way it had always been. That was the way it would always be. The assembly voted to establish a formal emergency response network. They would coordinate civilian volunteers, maintain supply caches, and ensure that future rescue operations had better resources. But Jake knew the truth. The network would help, certainly, but humans had been answering distress calls long before any formal system existed. They would continue to answer them regardless of what infrastructure was in place. Far from Mars, in the depths of the Krell territories, the surviving raiders told their story. Commander Skzex had escaped the battle with his life, but he had lost everything else. His ships were destroyed. His crew was dead or captured. His reputation was ruined. No one would hire him for raids anymore. But more importantly, Skzex had learned something about humans that he would never forget. They were not like other species. They did not calculate risk the way rational beings did. When their own were threatened, they came with everything they had. And they would not stop until their people were safe or they were all dead. Skzex shared his story with other Krell commanders. He warned them to avoid human targets. The profits were not worth the risk. One human ship meant dozens more would come. One raid could result in the destruction of an entire raiding party. It was bad business. It was suicide. The warning spread through the criminal underworld of the galaxy. Pirates and raiders and slavers learned to recognize human ships and avoid them. The risk was too high. The response was too overwhelming. Better to target other species, ones that would not hunt you across the sector for revenge. In the Valdran Empire, the changes continued. New patrol routes were established with strict oversight. Commanders who accepted bribes were removed from duty. The treaty obligations with humanity were reinforced and clarified. The Valdran did not want another incident like Theta Sector. They could not afford the political fallout or the military implications. Ambassador Lisa Grant used the momentum to push for better relations between the species. She negotiated new trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and joint research projects. The Valdran were not suddenly friends with humanity, but they were becoming partners. That was progress. Other species watched these developments with interest. The Solex Collective, a federation of aquatic species, reached out to establish diplomatic relations with Earth. They had analyzed the Theta Sector incident and concluded that humanity would make valuable allies. Their protection of civilians and their willingness to honor treaty obligations were admirable traits. The Myran Commonwealth, a species of flyers who controlled several key trade routes, offered to open their space to human vessels. They calculated that having humans as partners would discourage piracy and raiding. No one wanted to attack a human ship when they knew what would follow. Even the Krix Empire, a militant species that had previously viewed humanity as potential rivals, began reconsidering their position. They respected strength, and humans had demonstrated a kind of strength that went beyond simple military power. The willingness to sacrifice for your own was something the Krix understood. It was something they valued. Captain Ben Torres returned to his work moving asteroids in the belt colonies. The Iron Mountain had been repaired, though the scars from the battle remained visible on her hull. Ben kept them as a reminder. His crew had voted to leave the damage marks rather than patch over them. They wanted people to see what the ship had been through. Ben's business improved after the battle. Clients specifically requested his services because they knew he had fought at Theta Sector. They trusted him to deliver their cargo safely. They knew he would not abandon them if trouble arose. The reputation was worth more than any advertising. Captain Claire Martinez accepted a position training colonial militia forces. She did not want to fight again, but she understood that her experience was valuable. Young people who might one day need to answer a distress call could learn from what she had been through. She could teach them how to survive when the odds were terrible. Claire often thought about the battle. She remembered the fear, the chaos, the moment when she thought her ship would be destroyed. But she also remembered the feeling of fighting alongside other humans who refused to quit. That feeling stayed with her. It made everything worthwhile. Captain Kyle Harrison continued his exploration work, mapping unknown systems in the outer reaches. But he installed better weapons on the Wanderer. He trained his crew in basic combat procedures. He prepared for the possibility that he might need to answer another distress call someday. Kyle had seen a lot in his decades of exploration. He had witnessed beautiful worlds and terrifying dangers, but the Theta Sector incident had shown him something about his own species that made him proud. Humans took care of their own. They came when called. They fought for each other with everything they had. The passengers from the Celestial Dawn settled in their new colonies. They built homes and started businesses and raised their children, but they never forgot what had happened in the Theta Sector. They told their children about the ships that had come to save them. They honored the memory of those who had died in the battle. Greg Sullivan, the former Marine who had led the prisoner uprising, became a teacher at a colonial school. He taught history and civic responsibility. He used the Theta Sector incident as an example of what humans could accomplish when they worked together. His students learned about courage and sacrifice and the importance of answering when called. Dr. Peter Walsh opened his medical practice on a frontier colony as planned. But he also volunteered for the Emergency Response Network. He trained other doctors in trauma medicine. He prepared supplies and equipment that could be deployed quickly if another crisis occurred. He had seen what happened when humans were unprepared. He would do his part to ensure they were ready next time. Linda Crane returned to her work at a colony medical station, but she carried with her the knowledge of what humans were capable of when pushed to their limits. She had seen people work together to save lives under impossible conditions. She had witnessed coordination and compassion on a scale that still amazed her. The memorial for those lost at Theta Sector was established on Mars. It was a simple monument, listing the names of the dead and the ships that had been destroyed. But it carried a message that resonated with everyone who read it. These people had answered the call. They had given everything to save their own. They would never be forgotten. Jake Morrison visited the memorial before returning to his ship. He read the names and remembered the faces. Some he had known personally. Others he had only heard over communication channels during the battle. But all of them were human. All of them had come when called. Standing before the memorial, Jake made a promise to himself and to the dead. If another distress call came through, he would answer. He would drop everything and go to help. It did not matter what the odds were or what the cost might be. When humans called for help, other humans came. That was not going to change. Jake returned to the horizon's edge and prepared for his next mission. The ship had been fully repaired, better than before. His crew was ready. They had routes to run, cargo to deliver, a living to make. But they all understood that their real purpose went deeper than commerce. They were humans in space. They were part of a network that stretched across the galaxy, connecting every human ship and settlement. When the